On this episode of Life in a Tide Pool, find out what made these marks on this rock, what this animal is, why it has a hole on the top of its shell, and how the blood of this animal can save a human's life. Welcome everyone to today's show. Today we're going to talk about these little animals right over here. These are limpets, and you can see there's a lot of limpets on this wall. Limpets come in many different shapes and sizes. We got the small white ones, and if you're looking really close, you can see this little tiny one over here. Limpets are one of the more common animals to see in the tide pool, and so that's what we're going to go explore today. Limpets are related to snails, like the ones in your backyard. The difference is that limpets absorb oxygen through the water, whereas snails in your backyard breathe air. Limpets can be found in most all zones of the tide pool. Most limpets live on rocks and eat various types of algae. There are, however, a few specialized limpets that prefer to live in very peculiar places. This limpet, for example, likes to live on shells of mussels and gooseneck barnacles, while these owl limpets prefer to live higher up in the tide zone on exposed rock surfaces. This limpet, on the other hand, is commonly found living on owl limpets. One of the best tide pool locations to see lots and lots of limpets, especially these large owl limpets, are the tide pools at the Cabrillo National Monument. The Cabrillo National Monument is located at the southern tip of Point Loma Peninsula in San Diego. The tide pools are characterized by many long, flat rock benches that are covered by algae. The tide pools are also bordered by these very high rocky cliffs with some rather large boulder fields that make great habitat for these limpets. I had the chance to talk with Ranger Bonnie Phillips to learn more about the park and also learn more about these tide pools. So Bonnie, tell us a little bit more about the park.
Well, Cabrillo National Monument was created in 1913, and initially for the commemoration of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo's journey in 1542, his exploration of the West Coast here in California. But over the years, we've discovered we have all these other educational themes here. One of the primary things that visitors like to come and see is the historic lighthouse that is actually on this peninsula as well, from the 1850s. In addition to that, we have very rare coastal sage scrub, perfect for a Mediterranean coastal climate.
Right. So we got the lighthouse over there, and I know we got the tide pools. We'll talk a little bit more over here in the sagebrush. What about the really stunning views on the other side of the hill over there? Tell us about that.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things visitors tell us when they come to this park is the wonderful views of the city of San Diego that they have. We're 423 feet above sea level up here, at least at the lighthouse, a little bit lower at the visitor center complex. But you can get a view of the bay, all the ships going in and out of the bay, the whole city. It's really quite spectacular.
Right. So how big is the park here? How many acres or square feet do you have?
The park's about 160 acres in total. And then a lot of that, though, is made up by the vegetation. So sometimes it has a smaller feel. That's also kind of nice, I think, for people. It's a small San Diego hometown park.
Before we actually go explore the tide pools down over there, I know it's important for visitors to understand some of the rules and regulations the Park Service has to ensure the safety of the marine animals and also the people themselves. So can you tell me a little bit more about what those regulations are and what the sign means?
Sure, absolutely. Because we have about 215,000 people that visit the coastal area of the park and about 100,000 actually in the tide pools per year, it's really important that people leave everything where they find it. So all the shells, rocks, sand, everything everything stays in our tide pools. And what has happened in the past is in the 70s and 80s when things were removed, these tide pools were pretty decimated. And so they've made a major recovery. They're by no means pristine yet. We'd like to get them back to those conditions.
So I can touch maybe with 1 or 2 fingers, again, nothing hard. Obviously no picking anything up, right?
Exactly. No picking anything up. Occasionally we'll allow some picking up of the hermit crabs as long as they get put right back where they are. But all other animals, especially the ones that are firmly attached, because actually picking them up when they're attached like that can kill them.
Right. Well, this is very good information. So what I like to do, can you show me actually the tide pools? I see them right over there.
Absolutely.
I'll follow you.
Let's go.
The tide pool area is accessible from the parking lot by taking a trail along the top of the cliff. The trail branches off and leads down to the ocean where the tide pools are located. Our first stop is at the top of the tide pool entrance, where a visitor can see the vast tide pool area. So one of my favorite things about this tide pool location is it has some flat areas over here, and it has a lot of nice rocks for people to go see the animals and things like that. So can you tell me a little bit more what makes this location so unique?
Sure, absolutely. I think what's really special about this place is you don't need a boat, you don't need a scuba gear, and you can actually walk through the wild habitat as if you were walking underwater, because later on tonight this will be underwater, and so we are walking underwater right now.
I actually can see right here, there's algae on my feet, and I see little periwinkles and stuff, and so it looks like the water is almost theoretically come up like 8 feet or so from that location, right?
Yeah, we have about a 10-foot tidal range here. So 7 to 8 feet is about our max high tide, and -2 feet is about our lowest low.
Okay. So I came here a little while ago, a couple months ago, and I was looking around in the area. And what I didn't notice a lot of sea stars. Why would a visitor not expect to see too many sea stars at this location?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we'd love to know the answer. Our sea stars and our mussels actually crashed in the early 90s. And we've done some research on it. We'd like to do more, and eventually, hopefully, they'll come back. One of the reasons was take. The other was a virus that came through affecting the mussels and possibly the sea stars. And here at Cabrillo, they just didn't recover. They just didn't come back.
Right. So when you mean take, is that people actually taking the animals out of the environment?
Yeah, actually removing the animals as souvenirs.
Okay. So one of the things I do notice a lot of here, and we're going to go explore it a little bit later on, is all of the limpets. Thousands and thousands of snails and limpets. Tell us a little bit more about those.
Sure. Well, the giant owl limpet was actually heading the way of the abalone because of take. But as soon as we started our protection program in 1996, they made a huge rebound. And so we have a really, really good, healthy population of owl limpets right now.
The tide pool area just off the trail tends to get very crowded. The southern portion of the tide pool area is much less crowded and has a higher diversity of marine life. On my way over to this area, I spotted something very unusual in the kelp that had washed up on shore. This is a shark or a ray egg case and is very easy to miss if you have not seen one before. The flat rocks in this area are also covered by the slow-growing type of algae. They seem to cover almost all of the low-lying rocks in this area. I arranged to meet one of my colleagues, Jay Smith, who will help us explore the tide pools and learn more about the limpets and the various types of algae that grow in this region. I notice here that this is not exposed rock here. I think there's going to be what is this? Is this algae covering the rock?
Yeah, so this is an algal turf. And really, it's a mixture of a lot of different types of seaweeds. Sort of the base of this is made up of a red alga called a coralline turf, and so this seaweed actually deposits calcium carbonate in its tissue, makes it really herbivore resistant. And then you have a lot of other things mixed in here, some green ulva over here, and lots of different red types of seaweeds. A few anemones.
So Jay, tell us a little bit about this plant sitting on top of this rock here.
All right, so this is another brown algae. It is called a rockweed, and really common in the mid-intertidal zone.
Okay.
Lays over the rock. It's got this holdfast at the base, and it's got all this biomass or this canopy that lays over. And it's actually really important as far as an ecosystem engineer, as you get a lot of organisms that live underneath that canopy.
Right.
And so you can sort of see that on top here it's a little bit dry because the tide is out and the sun's beating down on the top. But if you lift it up, everything's still wet underneath. So
right.
That really keeps a lot of these organisms safe.
Right. So I can see, right over here, that's one of our little friends, the limpet here, right?
Limpet there.
And we got some of those are the barnacles right there.
Yep, so we got some volcano barnacles.
Okay. So I also see some more brown algae over here. And so tell me what this particular one, I see this a lot here in the environment.
Yep, so this is called a feather boa kelp. So it's one of the many different species of kelps along the coast. It really likes the low intertidal zone, wave exposed habitats. And it's got this really big stipe that goes down the middle and all these tiny little blades that come off of it.
We left this one location and started working our way further south to an area where there are lots of large rocks and boulders where hopefully we're going to have a good chance to see some of these large owl limpets. So Jay, this is actually a fascinating rock that I see over here. So I have many questions about this. So what I first noticed is, why are these rockweed only growing here?
So this is probably driven by what we call tidal zonation. And so as you move from the low intertidal up into the high intertidal, you see this distribution of different types of species. And so here's a clear-cut example of, well, here's what the tidal height that this rockweed likes. And if it goes any higher, it can't deal very well with the desiccation and will probably die off. So this is sort of its upper limit of where it can survive.
And that's the drying out of the air and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I also noticed a lot of people will maybe mistakenly think this is maybe tar or something like this, but this isn't tar, is it?
Yeah, so there's a number of seaweed species that really look like paint on the rocks. And so here's a case where this guy looks like black paint on the rocks. And so this is a brown seaweed. We see other examples of a pink coloration, which is a red seaweed, and a dark red coloration. And so it really is actually a living organism on the rock.
Right. So actually, these are both types of algae,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So another thing I know, this is an owl limpet over here. So it's all by itself, and I noticed that the black algae here, or some of the smaller algae, is not here. Does this have anything to do with that?
Yeah, so this guy is a grazer, and so he has radula underneath the bottom of that shell there that scrapes on the rock. So it scrapes off a lot of the microalgae and the tiny algae that's on there. And so he holds the territory. And so you can see by the size of this guy that he probably needs a lot of territory in order for it to graze on enough food to survive. And so it's probably grazed off all this black algae here and kept it a little bit lower in the intertidal zone.
Right. So he's not moving now, but I know they move very slowly. Now, are they nocturnal, or is it during the day, or when do they move around?
They move around when the water's up. And so they clamp down on the rocks when the tide is down so they don't lose a lot of water out of their body and then dry out and die. But when the water's up, then they're free to move around and graze on the rocks.
There are three types of algae commonly found in tide pools. They are the brown algae, red algae, and green algae. The brown algae are typically the larger types of algae, like the feather boa kelp, sea palm, and the giant kelp that grows offshore. The red algae tends to be smaller in size, but tends to cover larger areas. Green algae is not as common, but comes in a variety of shapes and sizes. Algae is very important in tide pools in that it provides food for a wide variety of animals, like limpets, snails, crabs, sea hares, and much, much more. Owl limpets are thought to live for several decades. They also tend to live in the same area for most of their lives. I have seen this particular owl limpet on the same rock ever since I started visiting these tide pools many years ago. So one of the things I'm always get asked a lot when I'm doing walk around exploring tide pools is, what's the difference between algae, kelp, and seaweed? What is that?
Okay, so algae is sort of a bigger term for all the species that fall into an algal group. They're basically all plant-like protists, so they're not actually true plants. And so that falls for freshwater algae, algae that grows on ice, and so that's really a big group. And then you narrow it down to what we call seaweeds, is really limited to algae that are in the ocean, usually more towards the bigger seaweeds. And then a kelp is really specific to a group of brown algae. And so there's the giant kelp, which is a really common off our shore, but there are a number of other kelp species as well.
So I was walking along this really nice flat area over here, and I happened to look down, as I often do, and I noticed this animal down over here. This is what's known as a giant keyhole limpet. And this keyhole limpet here, he has this nice fleshy material, kind of foot or mantle, that actually covers the animal at various times of the day. So this is one of the many limpet species that we actually have down here at the Cabrillo National Monument. We've seen some other ones, but this is by far the largest limpet that we have down here. These keyhole limpets are some of the largest limpets that live in our local tide pools. I wanted to learn more about these interesting animals and to find out what the hole on the top of the shell is used for. I went to visit another colleague of mine, Professor Bruno Pernay, at the lab to find out more information about these keyhole limpets. For a lot of people who may not know what a limpet is, a limpet is, again, from a structure standpoint, it's basically just this flat little animal, and it has a foot, right?
Right. So all snails have one foot.
So what do you mean foot? What is a foot?
So a foot is just a muscular organ that they use to crawl over the substratum, over whatever surface they're on. So they move over it using these waves of muscular contraction that pass down the length of the foot. So
right.
It's pretty interesting to think about how an animal can just have one foot that it uses to stick on something and at
right.
the same time move over it.
So these are very readily visible in the intertidal zones, the upper intertidal zones, because they move around a lot, don't they?
They do, especially when the water is in. So when we see them, usually when the water's out, they're not moving around. They're just sort of sitting around there waiting for the water to come back in. But when the water's in, they move a lot, looking for food, looking for mates, that kind of thing.
So what do these types of limpets feed on? What do they eat?
Well, the ones that you see in the intertidal zone, high up in the intertidal zone, are using the structure that most mollusks have called a radula to scrape away at the substratum. And what they're eating is a thin film of algae, usually that's growing on the substrate, on the rock. Sometimes they're also eating bigger seaweeds and that sort of thing, but mostly they're eating unicellular algae or very small algae that are covering the rock.
Is there any specialized functions about the radulas that these animals have?
Yeah, absolutely. So remember we talked about these living in the high intertidal and
right.
scraping algae off of rocks?
Right.
Well, when they're scraping algae off of rocks, the teeth on this radula, so it's basically like a tongue with these backwards pointing teeth on them, and they use this to scrape off material. They're scraping against rock, so those teeth tend to wear down. So this type of limpet embeds opal in the tips of their teeth to make them much harder.
Opal as in the rock opal?
Opal is in the mineral, right?
Mineral,
yeah,
right.
So these have that kind of scraping, very, very hard radula. These actually have a very different kind of radula that's much softer, but they're not feeding on the same kind of food as these are.
So what's this animal down here? This is also a limpet, right?
This is also a limpet. This is a keyhole limpet. This is a giant keyhole limpet. We actually have a different species of keyhole limpet in here, a very small one right here. But this is called the giant keyhole limpet. This is probably about as big as they get, maybe a little bit bigger than this. This is a very common thing in the Southern California intertidal.
So what is this fleshy material on the outside of this?
So yeah, these often look kind of strange relative to other limpets. They do have a shell, but sometimes you can hardly see the shell because of this tissue that can be pulled over it at will. They can also pull it back. This tissue is underneath the shell. There's a tissue called the mantle, and they actually use that to secrete the shell. So in keyhole limpets, they're able to actually take that mantle and extend it over the top of the shell. So they can actually cover over the whole thing so that no shell is visible.
So what are some of the adaptations that these animals have for living in that very harsh environment?
Well, wave action, one of the chief things you have to do is to be able to hold on, and limpets are great at holding on. If you ever try to remove one from the rock, you know that this foot, the bigger the foot is, the more surface area it has, the sort of stronger their attachment, and that's a lot of surface area for a pretty small animal, so they can really hang on very well.
The outer shell is a very good form of protection.
Yeah, absolutely, against predators, for example, so they can clamp down on the rock and really seal themselves off from potential predators. There are some predators who've managed to figure out how to get them off rocks, of course.
So I also know that some of these giant keyhole limpets are used in some sort of scientific research.
These all mollusks have a blood protein that carries oxygen called hemocyanin, which is this copper-based respiratory pigment, and the hemocyanin in these giant keyhole limpets is used as for scientific research for a whole variety of ways. First of all, to understand how hemocyanin works, and then some other aspects of biotechnology as well. So people routinely collect the blood from these to purify that protein.
Oh, wow.
This compound is similar to human blood in that it can transport oxygen around the animal's body. Instead of hemoglobin, which uses iron to bond to oxygen in human red blood cells, Hemocyanin in mollusks uses copper to bond to the oxygen. This compound is being used more frequently in biotechnology to help with treating various kinds of cancer. The hemocyanin is very effective in transporting antibodies that fight cancer to where the tumors exist. The hemocyanin found in the giant keyhole limpets, also known as KLH, is particularly effective in transporting antibodies and helping to treat several types of cancer. There is, however, a growing concern among fisheries biologists about the overharvesting of the limpets to provide the KLH for medical purposes. This concern has led to several national research studies to establish the feasibility of a mariculture production of giant keyhole limpets.
I want to look at this foot a little bit more. So what's that piece right there?
Okay, so this piece,
This.
so that is his head actually. So
Okay.
we're looking at the mouth right in the center of the head. And so his radula would be sort of extending out from that periodically as he's scraping. You can see a pair of sensory tentacles on either side of the head.
Right there.
Yep, there's one. They're kind of short and stubby.
Right.
And then this is all foot. So
Right.
remember, that's all that muscular tissue that they used to call it the substratum.
And this out over here, this is actually the mantle you're talking
That's
about,
the
right?
mantle that secretes the shell and also can get reflexed back over the shell for protection.
Right, there it is. So this is a really big juicy foot over there, right?
That is a big juicy foot.
How is this related to abalones?
Pretty closely related to
Yeah,
abalone.
so this is,
Yeah.
in terms of an abalone, this is kind of the piece that people will eat, right?
Right, exactly. That muscle of the foot is what an abalone steak is.
Right, so he doesn't like being out in the air, so he's retreating back into his protective state, isn't he?
He doesn't have very far to retreat, though, with that kind of a shell. So
So he's
you
pretty
often
much-
do find these exposed in
Right.
the intertidal zone, right? So they can handle being out in the air for a while.
So this little piece hole up on the top, what's that used for, this limpet?
So most limpets, like these other ones, have a solid shell. So we can see this one, it's just a conical
Yeah,
shell,
there's
right?
no hole there.
But this guy has a hole, and so do other keyhole limpets. That's why they're called keyhole limpets. And you can see a little bit more mantle tissue sticking out there. And so what that hole is used for is the way these breathe, as we mentioned, is by passing water over these gills that are in this cavity underneath the shell here. So
Right
water
there.
comes in from the front and the sides, passes over the gills, and it goes out that opening. So it's basically an escape route for used up water.
Abalones are closely related to limpets. There are 8 species of abalone that live in California waters. Abalone are different from limpets in that they can grow much larger and typically have 1 or more holes on the top of their shells. Most all limpets, however, live in deeper water and rarely seen by tide pool visitors. Another reason that abalones are rarely seen in tide pools is that there are very few of them. Most are endangered and protected by state law. The abalone populations have declined because of a variety of reasons, but overfishing is the primary reason for their decline. Only the red abalone can be harvested in certain parts of Northern California. There are, however, several programs that are working to increase the abalone populations and get them back to sustainable levels. I went to visit the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium to learn more about their abalone restoration project. Today with me, I have the director of the aquarium, Mike Schack, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about the research and some of the conservation efforts that the aquarium is involved in. Mike?
You know, Casey, it's great to have you visit us. And really, we're in the aquatic nursery where what we do is we grow young sea animals and young scientists.
Right.
So that's really what we do in here. And we're working with many different animals so that the youngsters can learn the process of science.
Right.
That's what's so important.
So I know you got a couple of specific projects you're working on here in the aquarium. Can you give me some of the 2 or 3 main projects you're working on?
From a conservation point of view, we're working with the endangered white abalone. We're part of a permit that is by Bodega Bay Marine Lab up north. And we're working with other facilities trying to raise those animals.
I guess why do we want to raise the juvenile animals? Are they endangered? Are they being overfished, over-harvested?
In the case of white abalone, that's exactly the case.
Okay.
They have been over-harvested, which is what put them on the endangered species list. So that's how they got there. But for some of the other animals, like Garibaldi, they are protected, but their population isn't endangered in any way. The process there is that the youngsters that are learning to grow these baby fish from eggs
Right.
all the way up to adults are learning the process of science and learning the husbandry, the different activities it takes to keep them healthy as they grow.
Right, right. This is an amazing facility. It's almost like a research facility here. Do you mind showing me around a little bit more?
Sure, let's go.
Come on, let's go. So Mike, this looks like here abalones, if I'm not mistaken. I know you do some research in the white abalones. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this exhibit or facility is used for?
These are red abalones, and these are young ones. I say young ones, and yet they're already mature. They're old enough to breed. We have the ability with our with the scientists that we work with to cause them to release their eggs and the sperm when we want them to, so we can get in vitro fertilization.
I see.
And then our young scientists quite often use those babies and grow those up and learn the best ways to grow them.
So I can look at here at the abalones and I see, I'm pretty sure this is the mouth, the radula part here. So what is it actually doing right now?
So these are snails, and they have teeth on their tongue, and that is called the radula, just as you said. So what they're going around, this animal is licking the glass, hoping to get whatever film of diatoms or tiny algae that's growing on the glass.
Right, right.